Recording in progress.
We are here to pick up. There has been a little, let's just say a little action on the superhero, nerd, Marvel front since we've gotten together that's been important. Had to wait until we're both caught up. Yeah. It's, man, let's just say it's a whole multiverse of stuff to talk about. Gee, there's a reference.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're gonna start today. See where it takes us too, because it's a fascinating. It was a fascinating project to see done the way that they chose to do it. But we're talking about Marvel's Moon Knight. I got turned on to Moon Knight several years ago, actually because of the DID diagnosis or the Dissociative Identity Disorder. I was talking to someone who had DID, and this was back when the movie Split came out. If people are familiar,
I remember that one. Yeah,
the secret sequel to Unbreakable, and the second in the trilogy that turned into Glass. That we won't. Yeah. That's people have feelings.
There's a whole other rabbit hole we can go down later. Put that on the to-do list, Dwight.
Yes. But when I asked this individual, I said, "So when you see that depicted, is that offensive?" I was just curious, right? Because McAvoy's performance was really good, and I was at the time talking to someone tangentially about it for a movie podcast that a friend of mine was doing, and this person just said no. They said, "I don't personally find that offensive." Also, there's a spoiler for Split. It kind of turns out that the person is not mentally ill. They actually are possessed by this other, whatever creature or something. So they actually have some superpowers that go along with it. And maybe they're not actually DID, is what this, the person pointed out. And they said, but, and once again, not representative. They said it certainly probably is very offensive to some people. They said the thing that bugged them, though, was you don't see many other characters with DID unless they're scary or murderers. And so there we go. And it was around that time but all of a sudden Moon Knight's right in front of me, and I'm start asking people like, so which Moon Knight should I read to get, And so when this came out and they announced it, I was excited. What's your background with the character?
And this is the thing, the series that I got into was actually where it's the one that has to do with the West Coast Avengers and the schizophrenia diagnosis. Well, and since it's this idea that it's been a place where it's been like so many other Marvel things, there's variations, right? So you've got the possession by Khonshu. You've got these other things that go into mental health and have you question what reality is, which I also find really interesting when you're looking at anything that's done. Whether it's, like we're mentioning with the Unbreakable trilogy, or again, especially something in the Marvel universe, well, what's your reality, right? Because these are constructed realities and anything. So that's where I got into it. And so when this one came up, and interesting that you had somebody ask you that question, I was kind of like, you can read whatever you want, but also what I've come to learn, through the MCU is that if they are going to draw from canon, they're not going to necessarily, you're never getting that, here's the blah, 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 blah series. And it's, it'll be, we've taken some things from this, we've done this, but then they'll also bring in new things that are still consistent, but there's new canon. And again, which only makes sense, especially now that we finally officially have a multiverse, but in the movies, but it's literally, been in the comics and in my mind, in there forever. So for me, it was just I just want to sit back and enjoy the ride and see what they do and how they do it and what kind of position, what perspective you're given, especially in light of how they've played with perspective before. And again, I would say that one of the best examples would have been with WandaVision and that idea, of watching the show and watching it change, in terms of eras and those kinds of things. And and then people coming in and out of the, changing and coming in and out of the hex and all those kinds of things. So that for me, it was a sit back, watch the ride, see where it goes. Okay, yes, they've mentioned, dissociative identities. So let's see where they go. I think the part that I loved the most was wondering what they were going to do in terms of the relationship, again, predominantly with Mark and Steven. And who is going to be okay, yes, technically it's always Mark that's considered the primary or the original identity, but are they going to do that? And the fact that they started with Steven was like, okay, where are they going with this? How are they going to do it? And the fact that going to your thing about representation, the fact that it has been done, what I would say is very thoughtfully, empathetically, and that the humor that's there is not any kind of a demeaning humor. It's sort of the weird thing about the, oh my God, I've just woken up, or what's the thing, or saying this, like something that I guess you say the organic humor that comes out of that disorientation. Like, poor dude is like, going on a date with somebody, but and then, okay, I'm ready for the date. And 2 days ago, I guess I'm going to have a steak now because I feel bad for the waitstaff. And,
and I'll tell you, I mean, right in that first episode, they really captured some of the things that are not depicted very much with like severe mental health, especially it deals with anything with psychosis, DID, and which DID obviously, DID, schizophrenia, not the same thing, but they're depicted very closely sometimes.
Closely, yeah.
But anything that has to do with a break from reality, they love in Hollywood or whatever, in fiction, they love to depict the scarier elements, the mysterious elements. But the thing that they don't is actually the biggest risk to those who have those diagnoses is sadness, loneliness, depression. That it's very depressing to, I mean, that and Oscar Isaacs does a great nonverbal. For some reason, as I was watching this and he would switch personalities on camera, it was like I felt like he was working out at a micro expression level almost, And his
when you see the two of them scream side by side, and he's got two different screams and two facial expressions.
Yes, and he does that scene you mentioned where it's like, oh, I made a date, I missed it, I don't know what day it is. I don't know what the hell's going on. And then while the waiter comes up and he does that, where of course, and the character's a vegan, doesn't know how to order a steak really, but doesn't care. And so there was all this crestfallen, you just felt that for a minute where it was like, that would be so sad. Just the sadness, not so much even the social awkwardness, which once again is played up in most projects, but they really, and then again, when he wakes up on the bus after having this horrific experience with Khonshu. And so there's this like just sadness, fear, you get this like depressing feeling of, I don't have control of my life. Right.
And that's what I loved about it the most was you're not necessarily seeing it through his eyes, but you are getting what I would say, Stephen's perspective on things. You're getting the most, what I would consider most authentic thing, because like you say, the representation always tends to be that external and scary. Look at the scary person that's behaving this way. It's erratically, it's disorienting. And it's like, no. Now you're seeing the disorientation from their perspective, and you're seeing the disorientation. So, and I remember a friend who, again, knows that I do the Marvel stuff and all this kind of stuff. This was not something they were familiar with. Like, they're more familiar with, again, Spider-Man and the other big names kind of thing. And, wanted to watch this. And it was this, what's going on? I have no idea. It's like, oh, you're 3 episodes in and you're confused. Good. That's where you're supposed to be. Like that actually, if you think you are finishing an episode and knowing at the end what exactly is going on, you're missing the point. Like it's if you're confused, good. You're supposed to be just as confused as the characters are, because, and to me, that's the authenticity of it, because you're literally, again, there is no, the origin story doesn't come till the end. You're walking in midstream into this poor bugger's life, and he doesn't know what's going on. He's getting, again, very lonely, lives by himself, has a horrific boss and staff, fellow staff members that don't know his name, tries to be nice to a kid. Like he's just like, they embody that. And you just like, how could you not be anything but empathetic with Stephen Grant?
It's interesting too, because as you mentioned, and I think movies at this point, when we were growing up, there's this attitude of like, if you go to a superhero movie, you look for a retelling of a comic book. Now they've actually jumped into where it's its own continuity. It's like a run of comics that is different. Spider-Man, Iron Man was his mentor in this universe, in this version, right? Where it wasn't, and whatever. And so one of the things that they redid is, and I'll say, having read some of Moon Knight before this came out, I'm not going to claim to be anybody out there who's a really, really into Moon Knight and has a lot of info, and you feel free to correct me, and reach out to or whatever. But
same here. Like, again, that's not my biggest rabbit hole in the Marvel universe. Might become one.
If you're real. If you're real angry at me, just tweet at me at speak-up. Is that what it is? I'm trying to think of how. I want to send it to your Twitter to get mad at me. Anyone angry, just hit Sharon up and tell him that guy sucks. But no, anyway, but my experience is that Stephen Grant in the comics, this is one thing they changed, where Stephen Grant was like the Bruce Wayne figure. It was like this millionaire, and when he is Mr. Knight, as we see in the suit and everything, he's driving around in a limo doing his fighting evil version of, like, you know, Mark being Moon Knight, swinging from rooftops, right? So they have this kind of different thing where he is like the philanthropic. Philanthropic. There we go. It's easy for you to say, not me. But, so, you know, he is that person, and that's a fine character. But it was interesting to see how not only does this someone that I feel like maybe most of us can relate to a little bit better than that mysterious millionaire, but also encompasses what we're talking about, which is the risk of I'm just over here in my own little corner, and I can't really invite anyone else in. Right. I can't really feel safe inviting anyone else in. I've got myself chained to a bedpost to make sure. I've got a sand trap to make sure I don't leave, you know.
I tape up my door to make sure that, all these things. Well, and I think that's the other thing is this is the other part of it, is that you've had those different variations again with the different, I mean, even originally, if I'm trying to remember which version it was, I think it might've been the first one, where it was the idea that these are actually alter egos, like secret identities that he used to facilitate different things. So I'm the same guy, but I go under this name to do this, and it allowed him access to different worlds. So, I mean, they've already played with this a little bit, and I love the way they're playing with this now. And the fact that, like I said, to me, it was the walking in this way that it was, again, very empathetic. And that, again, like you say, very sad, because he has these experiences, and then they view the videotape of what happens in the museum, and he's like, oh, wait for this, and you're like, okay, no, dude's all by himself, there's none of this stuff, and it's the, oh gosh, okay, this is a me thing. And so this idea, though, of, like, again, what the reality was, what these different characters represent, I also found it interesting too, that as you go further along in the story, as to who, you know, who's protecting who, because I think the other part that a lot of people forget is where disassociation fits in, and how, and what. So, I mean, all of us disassociate in some way, shape, or form. At some point, we've all done the driving to the work or driving to the mall or whatever, and you get caught in your own thoughts, and then you're pulling into the parking lot going, how did I get here? And I'm assuming that if any accidents might have happened along the way, the sounds out, or, you know, that I may have caused, like there were the sounds of brakes or screeching or honking or something that got me out of it.
Right.
Yeah. So we've all had that. So I think that's even where that similarity to the bus was, like, you know, that's right up there with the nodding off on the bus or the subway, and you do the thing, and oh God, because you've fallen asleep, weird dream. So it was that idea that, you know, they gave you kind of those little tastes of it, but then on that larger scale of, okay, well, why? Like, it doesn't, you know, okay, not, you know, those kinds of things that happen in daily life. Well, it happened for a reason. You got caught up in your own head. Some part of your brain, you know, has driven this route 15 times, you know, every week. So therefore you're on autopilot, and it keeps you safe, hopefully. But it's still that, oh my God, I was operating a 1-ton vehicle.
Yes.
And on autopilot, not cool.
Even a cupcake truck, you know.
Yeah, exactly. So the fact that he was doing these things, and that was the other part too, when you see him moving between these different places, and then you're realizing, like, he's losing days. This is not just and that you're losing track of the reality. And especially too, and I think this is where I like about how they did it. And again, you find this out, like, not in a linear way, but that whole thing that we were dropped into the middle of his life. We are then dropped into him, you know, suddenly being in different places. And again, suddenly he's got this voice in his head. And then you realize later on, as Mark tells him, well, it all had to do with, you know, it all started around the time of Mom's death. That's when the walls between us started to break down. So you realize it's about these two people that have been inhabiting the same body, the same brain, but they literally haven't got to know each other or become really aware, or at least one less aware of the, you know, the walls are finally coming down. So you're a part of that that relationship, eventual integration, and those things. And I think that was, again, something, yes, it's done in a certain kind of, you know, within this narrative arc, but again, thinking about the stuff that you and I would have been watching related to this, I mean, we're of the era where, first of all, we grew up with it, being called multiple personality disorder. And it was the time of like Sybil and, Sally Fields. And like you say, all the scary representations, and the one that always got me was the, in soap operas. And it was, I always, whenever that would come up for some character, you're like, my thought was always, okay, so somebody's getting upset that they didn't get the Emmy nod that they wanted. They don't feel like they're being pushed enough. They haven't had anything exciting happen with their character, yada, yada, yada. Oh, so now suddenly they're going to have some sort of dissociative identity, again, which would have been called something else then. But, and that even though they might have a little tag about it later on in terms of being like a positive mental health message, you're like, oh my God, this was so much more about them and the over-the-top drama and the movie of the week vibe, all that garbage. And then it's like, oh, we can, throw in a mental health thing and look progressive.
Yes, well, exactly. And trying to, when it's actually the opposite of progressive, where it's like, oh yeah, but one of them's the evil personality.
Yeah.
Of course,
oh God. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah. And not that they're necessarily, I mean, because storytelling is always fascinating with that kind of thing. And I guess, not to say that depictions are completely innocent of that, but there's a couple of things, some we've already touched on, that actually amplify this in a more healthy way, right? And for example, the functionality, and that's the piece that people forget. And when you go back to when there was this kind of splinter off and Steven started to come into existence, he was there to protect Mark. And we think of Mark's the soldier, he's the superhero fighter man, he's the whatever. And it's like, no, this happened. And typically this is where I heard this from a psychiatrist long ago, and I'm always interested in people's experiences who've actually been there. So anybody, once again, hit me up. But it seems to match most of the people I've met with DID, that you move from a place where you are vulnerable and weak to a place where you are stronger. Now, but stronger can be interpreted different ways, obviously. It's not like, I move into a personality who can murder everyone, which is like what the old school, like, the bad guy, whatever. It's like, in this case, it was, no, I'm going to move into a personality, a life that has a happy home life, that is this kind of, and when you look at it, one of the things about Steven is he's he seems a little bit like bullied and kowtowed or whatever to people who are pushing him around, but he's essentially a nice guy who loves his mom, who's interested in interested in antiquity and studies and self-improvement and all of those things.
It wouldn't hurt a fly. Always trying to be helpful, as opposed to when you think about all the guilt that Mark carries. So it's that idea of, from the, I consider myself a murderer, even about things that, because of things I've been blamed with, right back to a phase where it's like, okay, you were a child and this was an accident, but you're being held accountable for this, to all the other things where, again, you weren't necessarily the lead on this, or you were told, so it's all of this guilt and this negative perception of himself as this violent, murderous person. So what is the altar that he creates? This proverbial wouldn't hurt a fly guy that has the single finned goldfish. Yes. Got to get, that would have been oh my God, here's this poor fish and probably nobody else is going to take him. So I'm going to bring him home and I'm going to call him Gus and this and that, whatever. Yeah. Like it was just that, even the little girl, when she's sticking garbage in there, he doesn't like call her out. It's it looks like somebody's, mistaken this for a garbage dump and just, and whatever. And, and then, takes her over to the thing. Oh, this is where they're going to stick the hook in and drag all your innards out. Again, don't get me wrong, a little bit, there's a little bit of a dark thing there, but he was just trying to be Mr.,
and yet
polite.
And that one of the things that I also really appreciated about it was that he was not a weak character. He wasn't, I didn't feel like he was portrayed as a weakling. He was just, in the beginning first episode, I thought, he's not a weakling. He is someone who isn't comfortable in a fight with 6 mercenaries at once, but that's in that way very much like most of us. I think, a lot of people have this kind of like, this low key action hero vibe in their own mind of like, here's, oh, come on, just grab the gun. And it's like, no, most of us would be the person who throws the gun at someone and is like, oh, wait, that was a gun.
Like a
I
bullet,
probably shouldn't have thrown that. I don't know what I'm doing. And he literally says, I don't know what I'm doing. And he's the reasonable one when Conchi's like, hey, do something. And he's like, I don't know what to do. I'm a normal person. Yeah.
I've just woken up in a foreign country. People are doing some weird stuff. And now I'm having to run away again. And well, that was even, I think, the thing too with what's his escape vehicle? I mean, it's the cupcake van.
Cupcake truck, right.
Cupcake truck. And it's just, it's all of these things that I think were these really interesting nods. And then, like I said, you saw it in a sense from his perspective, because it's and then something happens and now I'm all bloody and what the heck. Okay, and people are, well, even the fact too that when he came to on that hill and he sort of pulls himself together and he sees those guys from the window and he like waves and he has no idea that these are the people that have been shooting at him, and he's just like, oh hi, people in the window.
Now there's speaking of a little Easter egg potential. I don't know if you saw this, but somebody online, this has nothing to do with anything clinical, but that castle. They never explain whose castle that is, really. I don't know that Harrow has a castle. He doesn't seem like a castle type of guy. However, it does seem to match. It's some kind of vaguely Eastern European country, potentially. And it does seem to look a lot like the castle of a certain Victor Von Doom, according to people, some comic panels that I've seen posted on Twitter. So there you go. Could it have been, maybe he was stealing that from Dr. Doom's personal library? Who knows?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the other part too, is now how they're doing all of these things where you can have interconnections and have these things, and a thing that might be a random detail over here turns out to be an Easter egg for something else, but you didn't know was an Easter egg yet. So, I'll keep.
They can just have it as its own little thing, or they can bring it back in later if people loved it too. You never know what they're up to. But one of the thoughts that I also have, along with the functionality piece, is they depict how the two, not the third as much. Maybe we'll mention him in a little bit, but the two that Mark and Stephen, there is also this friendship when they are thrown into the existential sort of like after death, afterlife, whatever, with the wonderful hippo goddess. That is, they have this meeting, this great meeting that I think I saw online. Everybody I saw comment on it loved this scene where Mark finds Stephen they're embodied separately, and the first thing they do is embrace. That they are in this together, that they can relate to each other in a way that no one else can, right? Whether they're angry with each other or whether they're hugging each other, that there's this real brotherhood kind of thing.
Right? Whereas everything before, and again, especially considering you're seeing it predominantly from Stephen's side initially, it was it was the reflection thing, which again, I also thought was a really interesting vehicle for how they would communicate, or how you would see it. And so it was always that, and there was always things, again, usually Mark telling Stephen, no, give me the body. I mean, that's the other part too, is, so he comes to, and it's like, give him the body, and give you what in the and so that idea that there was always this conflict, and Mark not wanting to tell him necessarily why. It's just like, no, this is the thing, and I need to do it, and you can't handle this. And where he made that one comment about no, actually, I have been through this before, same body, right? So hopefully some muscle memory. And you're like, well, okay, I'm not quite sure how that really translates the way you think it does, but not on one level, not a wrong assumption for him to be making as he's trying to sort this all out and wanting to be, and especially when you think about the fact that, again, at that place where they're walking in, and I think this goes to that whole how this stuff unfolds, is the fact that I clearly know something's up. I don't know what it is. I keep either, I'm clearly like blacking out, losing time, ending up in weird places. So I've got all of these things in place, but I don't know exactly what it is. And so I'm trying to stay up all night, and I'm trying to do all of these weird management things. And then again, they have the functionality of, okay, well, here's all the Egyptian stuff that I'm going to study, and here's all these, these things. And, you stop and think about it, like that is a much more, I guess you say, organic and natural process that on some level, yes, this has happened and there's been this creation of an altar, but it's done generally, in such a seamless way. Nobody sits down on a Tuesday afternoon and says, oh, I need to cope with this, and so therefore I'm going to manufacture this alternate identity and reality and and we all compartmentalize in certain ways, but and consciously, that's that's not what this is. And so when it's when other things come up that you realize something, and so it's this weird thing. Well, on one level, your brain has created it. You actually tend to go a very long time before you realize that, and you realize, and so it was that, to me, it was again that very natural thing where it's like, something's up, but I don't know what it is.
And it's very much like how people talk about this concept of hearing voices, and when we say that, it's like hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations. All of our brains have this capacity to hear things and say things. It's just, it depends on if the intensity, the frequency, and whether or not we are consciously having control of it. And so, we're all talking to ourselves in our heads all the time, right? Just like we disassociate and we compartmentalize and we segment, sometimes on purpose and sometimes organically, but we become... It becomes something that all of a sudden we look at as this crazy, weird, supernatural, creepy, but it's like, no, it's actually an extension of natural coping skills. It's just an inflated or I should say inflamed, perhaps. It was one way to put it. But one of the things that I thought was very powerful was the moment where Harrow, the bad guy, the Ethan Hawke bad guy, who turns to, he's talking to Steven, and he says, do you think Khonshu selected you because you were broken, or did he break you, essentially? And I love that part of Steven's reply, and that was, I'm not broken. Right? So here's someone who, is mentally vulnerable, who obviously has, dissociative identity disorder, as we would label it now. But he's saying, I'm not broken. And that I thought was a very powerful message to slip in there, which, and people I've known over the years who have come to accommodate their alternates, and to integrate into where there is that shared awareness. Once again, this is, Hollywoodified or whatever, but to say that there is actually strengths in each alternate and each alter that do take turns, and that handing the driver's seat over to someone consciously, often not consciously, but just sort of there is a trust in the greater intention to protect and be good for myself that people tend to develop over time as they get more healthy. And I think people usually would think, well, healthy means the alters go away, right? But that's not always the case. Everybody.
No, it's about the integration and the management. And that was the thing too, is watching Harrow and trying to figure out who Harrow represented. And especially when you see Harrow then as Dr. Harrow, and the idea that, he's saying the same thing in both places. And again, going to this idea, and maybe this is a little meta, he even made a comment at one point, again, about this idea of organizing methods, organizing systems, and that these are just frameworks. And then that conversation goes a particular way, like, these are just organizing things, and and we just, and you're like, oh, wait a second, you've naturally led to a place where it's like, what is reality? Because I think for most folks, and again, what you expect is and he comes to, and he's in a psych ward. So therefore that must be reality. And all of this is whatever. And you're like, well, wait a second. There is nothing to say that the psych ward actually isn't, in fact, just a construct, and maybe is a way of viewing all of these other things. So it's not about he sees these things in Harrow's office, and then based on whatever it is, he's now created these other identities and these other things influenced by these, or influenced by this childhood movie.
It's not a mental health version. This could actually be the organizing construct that allows him to sort some of this out in a different way. So there's nothing saying that that's the reality. And especially too, when that stuff happens again after he's been shot, and it's again, if he's just been shot, he's probably unconscious or in some other kind of a mental state. So again, is this really reality, or is it just, again, one of these things? And I think that's the part that I love about this, is that in my mind, I still don't know what reality is. And that as much as I know that there are
a variety of alters, and I going back and rewatching, we were actually introduced to Jake in the first episode.
Yes.
We just didn't know it. And that you have these different things, and especially, and you realize afterwards when there's these different things where it's like, wait a second, that's even bloodier than, oh, wait a second, oh, that's a Jake moment. Like, my guess is that stuff that happened with Harrow in that first, that's a Jake thing.
Yeah.
That was, but we just didn't know it was Jake because, again, like Stephen, we're just flipped out about the, what the heck, castle guy with the,
and
even
even in a more subtle way. So it wasn't until I'd seen the second or third episode that someone else said, when it was something online where those of us who knew that there's a Jake Lockley in there, that there's a third more violent personality, or at least more street scrapper kind of personality that has less rules, let's say, still a good guy, anti-hero kind of approach. So we're kind of like, are they going to bring him in? Are they not? They changed Steven. What are they going to do? Somebody else brought this up to me and I hadn't thought of it. Who asked the girl out? I mean, who asked that woman out? That wasn't Mark. Mark's not going to ask her out. He's, and so I was like, oh, no, that's right. Yeah. So
that didn't dawn on me until later, because at first you're figuring again, okay, they're going to play Mark and Stephen first and whatever. So you figure Mark and you're like, oh yeah, but there's the accent thing. And then it's like, oh, no, they've got his wife involved. So why would he? And then you're like, oh, wait a second. Exactly. There's, there's somebody else here.
Yeah, right away.
And they dropped it in the first one, but wasn't named. And at this point, again, like Stephen, you don't know what's going on. And even that realization, and again, Mark later on with the not wanting to take him into certain places in certain rooms, and that whole reality of, oh, wait a second, I'm not the primary identity.
Right.
And that, and so he had his, so they had that little existential crisis moment of the, who came first kind of thing. And, oh, wait a second, it wasn't me.
And where does this guy fit in? It's an interesting thing because is that leaning into, and I guess we'll have to see if and when they go on and we see more development with this character, the third personality, the third alter or second alter, I don't know how we're counting them. Anyway, the third personality that lives within Moon Knight. So are they leaning into the trope of here's a violent one, at least, well, okay, here's the evil, violent personality. I think at this point, to me, if I'm being, and I tend to be generous being a Marvel stan, right? So I look at that and say, maybe. It's like there's a risk there, right? I mean, they're risking stepping right into that, and they avoided it so elegantly with the other two. I guess you'll have to wait and see. I know based off the source material, Jake Lockley's like this sort of like street smart, like cabbie who is like a criminally involved, who's not afraid to get his hands dirty in certain ways, and takes care of some of the nastier things, like on Khonshu is like, kill this guy. It's like Mark would be like, I'm not going to just kill a guy, and Steven would absolutely not want to just kill a guy. And Jake would be like, is he a bad guy?
Yeah, exactly.
He's a bad guy,
Well, and I think that's the other part too, though, that even if you go into that where, yes, he's technically more violent, this is what goes back to the idea, and again, right from the very beginning of the whole stuff with Khonshu and the justice idea. So in other words, if he thinks he's doing it for a good cause, unlike Mark somewhat and Stephen for sure, and I would say even the whole like the Batman code of conduct, right? Jake does not have the Batman code of conduct. And so it's the whatever needs to be done, it's for the greater good. And so I think that's even why he's only kind of dripped in there in those little hidden, again, kind of Easter egg ways that because there's something else that he leans towards, and that's probably going to go more into the dynamic with Khonshu as well. And again, I would still see it as being less of the scary representation, stereotypical representation that we've seen of DI and of schizophrenia than where does this alter function and how and why. And so Stephen is, Mark has got this lousy batch of stuff and just tons of guilt. So here's Stephen that gets to have the nice, very, I would say proper life, in the sense that it's even like he's a proper English, guy that works at a museum and does all this, stuff. And he's just so kind and whatever. Is he quirky? Absolutely. But again, still very well-intentioned and polite. So I think that's the other part that I like about this whole, again, that portrayal there of Stephen, I think, is really wonderful. And I think what's interesting too is when you go into the Harrow stuff, Harrow's saying the same thing on both sides. And it goes back to that language that you mentioned about broken. In both cases, it's about brokenness. And what I came to realize is that in some respects, what he represented to me, I mean, yes, obviously there's the characters and again, what we're doing in terms of the narrative and the associations with different things. He kind of represents the broader society stereotype. So in other words, and knowing what's right, because that's the other thing. In both cases, he taps into some, I know better than you. Like, I've already dealt with Khonshu. I know all about this. And this is why da, 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 da. And this is why you need to do this and stop being used by him. But you got to come over to Amit now. Or it's the, his little nonsense pendulum. And I'm like, okay, I get where you think that works. But that, it's also oh, but why are you bleeding? And I still love the line where I don't think you know as much about this as you think you do from, and I'm like, actually, yes, there's the line.
The fact that it comes from, well, first of all, I mean, that's another Jake moment when he stands up and he's like, you must get pretty good. Yeah, you did pretty good at this, doc. Or whatever. And then but I love that it went to Stephen, and this is another example of Stephen being a personality of strength, right? Of strength in his positions, because he's the one who's like, look, do I think this is real, where I'm going to be in this hospital and look at your foot bleeding, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to go back to where I'm saving the world and be that character. And like a choice, like I'm making a choice to invest in the belief and the faith that this is my real life. And which also, which when he first has a conversation with Harrow as well, he actually, and they write it so that it's, it's a chuckle as well. It's a comedic-ish, but when he says, so you're going to take out people who are going to do something bad. So children? And he's like, is everybody here okay with that? And like almost incredulous, which once again, he is not a warrior. He's not a soldier. He's sitting surrounded by those bad people. He could easily go, yeah, whatever you say. Sure. I'm that weakling. But instead, he's principled and says, I'm not even going to pretend to agree with you. Really? You think you're up with
killing babies?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not even going to pretend to agree with you, because he's morally strong. Right.
Well, and even when he comes back, again, after they decide they're both going to do this together, and it's the whole renegotiating with Khonshu, and, he comes up as Mr. Moon and then gets into this, and like, oh my God, he sent the Indians, like, well, what are we going to do? And It's like, really, at a time like this with so much at stake, you're going to negotiate? And it's like, learn from the best, bird brain. Like, you taught me this. Like, if there's anybody that, and so he is a protector, and that you get those different lines too, especially again, I think about in Duat, and again, one of those times where there's the big hug and the whatever. It's like the no, like, you are actually, you've got nothing to apologize for. You've done all of these things. Like, he acknowledges what's happened to Mark and the role that they've played and all these different kinds of things. And I think that's the other part that I really enjoy about this, is that it's about this growing relationship between the two of them, which again, Bertie said this doesn't exactly parallel, the integration process that most would go through, but it does, I would say, reflect the energy and the authenticity of it in a cinematic way, and that we haven't seen done well otherwise. So yes, it's not clinically accurate, but I think it actually captures the authenticity of it, which I find really interesting when you consider, what kind of a fantastical world this is. They're actually able to capture the spirit, the energy, and the outcome in ways that's more authentic than the movie of the week, supposedly all pro mental health, fuzzy movies.
And if we can, and it's one of those things where if we can have a training montage where Rocky trains in a week to be an expert boxer, and we wink and nod at that, and we say, yeah, I know that it would take longer, and let's just assume that the music, this one song, is encompassing. We can certainly see someone accommodate their alters, right, in this way. And I feel like one of the great things, and I sometimes extend this farther than some people do, but I think you're cool. I'll see how cool you are
Yeah.
with it. As far as strengths based, I know you and I are both radically strengths based, is what I would call it, right? Where you talk about
Yeah.
the superpowers and everything that are inherent to our personality characteristics, even those that are defined as symptoms. I kind of wonder, at what point do we stop labeling everything with the D at the end, the disorder part?
Oh, well, and that's
Yeah.
why I don't actually call it DID. I call it
Yeah, see,
dissociative
that's good.
identity.
That's great.
Any place I can drop the disorder part, I do.
Because at a certain level, you have to look at it and say someone's brain, not everyone's brain is capable of forming alters and disassociating to the point where they have that big of a protector. As we said, we all do it. And especially if you work within a framework of internal family systems, or EMDR sometimes touches on this too a little bit, which is we all have these different emotional parts of ourselves. But to actually have one that is segmented off, even to the point where we might not, for a time in our life, even be aware it exists. There's certainly weaknesses, if we want to go superpower weakness. There's certainly risks associated with being that way. However, what is that if not? I mean, that's a superpower to have a mind that can disassociate at that level. I really believe not everyone has the capability of doing it, and who knows how many people, because this is usually almost always trauma, extreme neglect, abuse is what the
Which is
genesis
exactly
of
what you
these
see
things,
Mark
right?
has gone through. Yep.
And so how many people out there have dissociative identity and are alive today because they have it, that they would have not made it, in other words, one way or another, however you interpret that, right? Suicide
Exactly.
or abuse or addiction. If they would have
It's
been
it's the
constantly doing
brain
it.
trying to keep the brain and the body alive by whatever means necessary.
Yeah.
And so it's a trauma response. And yeah, when you think about the story that's there, so yeah, would Mark be alive if he didn't have this, much more positive, joyful person that gets to have a relationship with his mom and think everything is okay, and live, frankly, a kind of middling, nondescript life, as a polite, if albeit a little bit sort of milk toast British, gentleman. Like, it's just that it's like it's all the safe, warm, and fuzzy, even to the point that he's a little bit of a doormat, but then that's because he's so avoidant of confrontation, because Mark's life has been filled with so much. And when you think about, again, what he went through, and they have tweaked it from one of the other versions, like this is more about the family as opposed to some other stuff that had to do with the father as a rabbi. And again, so whatever, like, to me, that's one of the, that's like, you're fiddling with which kind of icing is on the cake when it's really about what flavor is the cake. And so it's the, you put sprinkles on this time instead of, buttercream, whatever. And so it's that kind of a thing where I think, to me, it makes perfect sense. It would be as far as a coping mechanism. And I think it gets reflected, first of all, and like you say, those "I'm not broken" comments, coupled with, again, in the duat, where he basically, in talking to Stephen, Mark says, you were my only superpower. You were my, it's not about these things that Khonshu gives me that makes me Moon Knight. It's the fact that you've actually protected me. Khonshu's made me do some stuff that, again, I thought, and I became indebted to him and whatever else. And this also makes me wonder too about the relationship with Khonshu. I kind of get the impression that, and again, being a god, it's kind of playing into this, but he's the omniscient one that's aware of all the personalities and identities, and that he's made arrangements with all the ones that he wants to work with. And then there's, geez, the idiot's
like,
got the body. Because he knows that Stephen won't go with this.
Well,
and when he has to do with it, then he has to do with it.
Like a manipulator or a bully, if we want to say. And Khonshu, even in the comics, is, famously, if you're, into it well, Khonshu isn't an asshole. He is a controlling, narcissistic. And it is one of those that is kind of you could say the Nick Fury of this situation, but you could go a little further and say oh my gosh, now I'm going to forget who's Viola Davis's character that she plays in DC, the evil or Nick Fury character from the DC world. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
Suicide
I know,
Squad.
and I'm drawing a blank too. And now you say it, the deeper it goes back into my brain.
Yes,
and I'll either blurt it out in 5 minutes or at 3 a.m.
Yes.
And again, feel free to hit us up on social media to fill in what's currently fallen out of our brains. We won't take it personally.
Yeah, if I can vamp just long enough to say Amanda Waller. There we go.
Yes.
I had to IMDb search the Suicide Squad.
Yeah.
But somebody who is the greater good. Although in the DC cinematic universe, she's straight up kind of a villain. But someone who's like, if I have to blow up this village in order to kill that one person who is like, now I don't know if Khonshu, whatever, I don't want to say that, somewhere in between. Let's put him in between Nick Fury and Amanda Waller. That's where we're going to put Khonshu on the scale of manipulating controllers. But it is important for Khonshu to put Steven down. And who knows, if we want to read maybe a little deeper into this than maybe I need to, but it's important to, if you're going to bully someone, they need to feel less than. And everybody else is like, don't listen to him, he sucks. And then as soon as you put it, I hadn't thought of this till you said it, as soon as Steven is involved, it's like, we're renegotiating. And it's like, all of a sudden, Khonshu, Mark didn't pull this off in all the years they've worked together. The other dude maybe didn't want to, but it's like Steven, Mr. Strength Protector, most moral of the three, probably most moral guidelines to say, most moral strength to say, we're renegotiating, buddy. This is not cool what you've been doing to us.
Well, and I think that also plays with the idea of, again, when we think of the stereotypical descriptions of alters and what roles they play, it's there's always and again, good Lord, pick a soap opera, pick a whatever. It's the so-called protective alter is always again, the big tough guy, the big that kind of thing. And you're like, well, no. Actually, the protector here is the soft guy. And it's because he's the morally strong, per character. He's the morally strong aspect of it. And so the rest of them while they might have the physical strength and they might be doing certain aggressive acts, are not actually as morally strong as Steven is. And I thought that was really interesting too. And even how they, first of all, introduced Khonshu. And again, it's about this idea of justice and protect, and meting out justice, to those who have done harm. And then to watch Harrow's character, who again, it's I used to be the avatar before, and this is the problem because now I go around with scales of justice. And, and I work on behalf of Amit, and it's the idea of, getting rid of people before they do the thing. And like you say, the baby comment, but what was really interesting is as you watch this, it's like, wait a second. Again, when you think of, again, what's the reality and what's the hallucination part of it, you think about those scales on the arm and the fact that everywhere Steven seems to go, it's like, oh my God, there's more people with scales on their arm. And again, this idea of the representation of the broader society where you're being judged, and everywhere you go, there's somebody with scales. Wow. And pass or fail. And that to me, in both of those realities, that's what Harrow represents, is the again, he's personified here, but the larger shoulda. This is somebody that's perpetually shoulding on you, telling you what you got wrong. And that, yes, Khonshu's got his own bullying narcissism thing going on. But when you bring in Amit and who Amit is, you're like, okay, well, wait a second. Suddenly Khonshu's starting to look a little bit more reasonable.
Right.
Because we got we got this crocodile purge thing going on where, apparently offing babies is okay because in 32 years, they might do a crappy thing. And just the whole, notion of free will. And suddenly you're like, okay, Khonshu is a jerk, but you know what? He is not the crown prince here right now. There are some people beating him at his own game. And that was the other part that I thought, because that's that one thing where you got, okay, so you've got the narcissist and that kind of shoulding that you're getting from both Khonshu in terms of his own agenda, Harrow, again, in terms of what he represents. But then you've got this other thing where, again, and it goes to that language of broken, where Amit and Harrow are like talk about your judgment and the broken notion, talk about to me, that's right up there with when folks used to say that those of us with diagnoses, should be sterilized. and that like it's like Amit's going down the eugenics path.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes, yes.
that never ends in a good place. I don't care what warm fuzzy place you start off rationalizing that and thinking you're doing it. Like the slippery slope starts about 2 seconds after you open your mouth on that, and then you're right down in the pits of hell.
Because there has to be an arbiter of what is and isn't broken and what is and isn't good or bad. And then of course immediately there's the hypocrisy there too, where Harrow is like, all right, you're back now. I assume I'm dead now, right? Because I suck and I'm this fanatic who I'm bringing to pass this brave new world that I don't deserve to be part of. And Amit's like, nah, screw it. And it's like, and even Harrow's like, oh, okay, well, it's kind of weird, but it's like it even takes your most fanatical follower aback to say, no, I like you, and by the way, the message, of course, being that now you're doing the same thing I'm doing, which is we're bad guys, and so we're not. I just want to control, right? Is kind of a thing, and it is interesting how it goes back to, in a way, here in a way, Moon Knight's championing those that are innocent, but also those that are guilty that are going to be proactively pruned. Because what going back to this, who decides, right? Who decides if a person does bad things, you can prevent the bad things. What if they reform later? That doesn't mean that they didn't do the bad thing if you're going on a strict scales, right?
Redemption arc. You're totally eliminating the potential for redemption arcs.
Yeah. And so, we wouldn't have Loki, the show. Anyway, that's what some people get a little salty about, even the level of redemption that's possible in that's why I hold out hope for we'll get into that in our next discussion about Multiverse of Madness. There's someone I hold out hope for there, and which we'll get to here in a minute for today's recording. But anyway, you get back to a theme that I think is I would hope that we're going to see it throughout this phase, but I think in Shang-Chi, you saw the desire to redeem Dad. In Spider-Man No Way Home, that whole thing is about going out of my way to redeem or save people who aren't even trying to be saved, right?
Yeah.
And so who knows, what we're going to see moving forward with some of these, but there's a theme developing that actually would make a half decent or maybe decent episode as well. We should think about that. The saving versus the punishing.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Well, and it's interesting too. You mentioned again, in terms of the comparison to, Spider-Man, because again, they're trying to see if they can redeem folks that, again, in some cases really don't want redemption. But one of the lines that Harrow uses, again, in both realities is the I can't help you if you don't want to help yourself. And it's like, well, wait a second, that sounds more, again, it's a well-meaning phrase and it has some value. Yeah, you can't, you can bring the horse to water, can't make them drink. People have to be at a right place in the recovery. But it's a double-edged sword because it can be meant in the sense of, okay, you have to get, and how many times have you been in a relationship with a client where it's all you can really do at some point is share what the next type of things are, share some ideas to get them to think about, and know that it's not like they're going to necessarily, pick them up and implement them right there, but that at some point, because you've sown those seeds, there's this something else happens, things unfold, and those seeds are able to, start to, take root, and they have this aha moment of, okay, you remember when you mentioned that thing to me? Oh, I get it now. Mm-hmm. I get it now. When you first said it, but it's like that's all you can do at that point is you're sowing the seeds. You're not expecting them to pick it up, but you at least know that you're laying the groundwork. And, while it would be wonderful and miraculous if in the next 24 hours that piece of advice or that therapeutic tool is used, you're also knowing that all I can do is keep mentioning it on a relatively regular basis in a way that I'm not shooting on them, but just a friendly reminder. And if they pick it up in 2 months, better than not at all.
And that's famously, it's a phrase that's famously used as a cop out, at least in the mental health industry and the substance abuse in particular. They weren't ready. Yeah. Well, if you're not ready, then I'll use that. There's a shaming to when treatment doesn't work. Instead of just saying, isn't it sad that this isn't working? We tend to say, let's blame the client or blame the patient.
Oh, okay. They're not at this place. This is a useful tool, but we're apparently a little earlier on in the journey.
Or maybe they're even doing something that's also healthy, but it's not what I wanted them to do yet. That's the other thing. Speaking of Harrow and speaking of being controlling, it's like, well, you didn't go through our program in the right order of steps. Oh, okay. Well, then I guess I suck. Thanks.
Well, and again, and how he would play those again in the same way that he would play the I know Khonshu. It's the I've had these same things, I've done whatever. And I think that's the, again, especially in light of what you and I do, is there's places for empathy and sharing, that you got lived experience. But the idea is that everybody's journey is their own. And so if you're sharing something like that, it's more about building a bond of a relationship to say, again, I've walked a similar path. I've got a similar experience to knowing that crappy headspace. And I'd like to be able to, again, build a relationship and let you know that I'm on your side. But I also understand that my path and your path are not the same. And just because we pass through the same intersection, we didn't pass through it in the same way at the same time with the same things under our belt. So just because I turned left down this other block doesn't mean you're not going to keep walking straight ahead or hop a fence, or do whatever in another direction. So I think that was the other part, was just that whole oh God, my God, if there was ever anybody Khonshu would get upset if you didn't do what he wanted to because he's the god and he's the boss and you're supposed to be his avatar. Harrow was like that weird, so you kind of go, okay, again, he's the cocky a-hole god. Harrow is this guy that is like, oh, you think you're playing the empathy card, but you're not. You think you're doing this thing, and it's like, right. I get what you think you're doing, but you're doing it really poorly, and it's really offensive, and then you're wondering why you get pushback, or the hold on, I'm just going to go save the world because I think that's far more useful than sitting here talking to you. Boom, I'm going to go back and so like I said, from what's reality, it because this is about, and again, we think about the larger thing, and we're in Marvel universes where, gods exist and people have, gamma rays do this and spiders do that and blah, blah, blah. We've already got a certain level of suspension of disbelief. But what I actually love about this is, that questioning of what is reality. Is the real world actually the one that has where the gods are involved? And is what we're seeing, because we see two different institutions as well. I don't know. Harrow refers to the Putnam one, and I can't remember if he says it. Is it Chicago or Philadelphia? I can't remember what city it is, but it's an American city. And then the final scene where you see Harrow being led out in the white limo that says Spectre on the license, that's the Cinque's. And you see them pulling out into London.
Okay.
And that's named after Bill, so the artist. So it's those kinds of things. It's not even is it the same place? Because it looked like the same place in some respects. Or again, even when Tara mentioned the whole, oh wait a sec, okay, I guess it can be whatever you want. I've just never done psychiatric institutions before, and that was the other part too, in terms of what's the reality, what's the hallucination, what's the construct. Really, would that kind of a goddess really be screwing up her lines that much if that's part of her job? Yeah. So again, what's the reality? What's the construct? Are they really dead, or are they? So I love the fact that in some respects it's more of a place to. It's a sandbox of sorts. It's like this intellectual and psychological sandbox. And that I think if we try to get too much into which place was reality, because I need to sort this out. I need to know who which you think from a very clinical perspective. Yes, we need to figure out who the primary identity is. We need to figure out what the alters are. We need to figure out what the hallucinations, delusions, and disassociations are. And we need to organize it all. And you know what? Sometimes, and I think that was where some of that pushback in the later episodes from them was coming with, wait a second, what if I don't accept your reality? Because you've just told me that, a pen is either a writing utensil or it's my dog's chew toy, and neither of which is wrong. So, so what's to say that I haven't made this up in this reality to sort some other things out because I'm trying to figure out how to deal with this really bossy, haughty God and my other identity, who we've had a lot of back and forth, push and shove, but you know what? Maybe the two of us together can sort this out. And you're just standing in our way. So, not exactly advocating for the sort of total client pushback, but that idea that sometimes I think, and again, that Harrow represents it, it's here, I've got a clinical path for you, and it's set out this way, as opposed to, okay, you know what? I have a rough arc. Yes, I've got a plan, but I've got a plan that's got flexibility enough to address things. And I'd like to think that we can check off the certain boxes along the way. But if we have to wind and do this and do that to get you there, you know what? I'm more about the big picture. And if we have to take a slightly different path to get to, points A, B, and C.
Before we go, tell everybody what is going on with Speak Up and just other things that they can find that you're doing.
I know before we've always gone down the rabbit hole of trying to remember all of my handles and whatever. So if the work that I do is about taking this kind of stuff, especially fandom and Marvel related stuff, and using it as a filter and a framework like we've been doing here to help people better understand mental health and neurodivergence diagnoses, lived experiences, and how we can better support each other, learn more, and address these things from an empowering perspective rather than these, again, negative, stereotypical things that we tend to be surrounded by. So www.speak-up.co is my website, and that'll have all the social media handles, so we don't have to go to that rabbit hole. And I also work in the world of BTS, Bangtan Soyeon, and use their music and videos to do the same thing because of, again, the positive reinforcement and the fact that they model a variety of different therapeutic techniques and peer support, and again, take a positive and empowering perspective on lived experience. So a lot of it's just been about updating some stuff. Thanks to Moon Knight, I am now going to be adding dissociative identity in there, because I think and we talk about in another episode of how well it reflects it, helps us understand it. And again, knowing folks with that diagnosis, how, again, it gives some, again, while cinematic, some authentic insight. So that's what I'm up to. Sort of the same old, doing some vast coaching for some different organizations where it's all about their employees that have come together under the shared diagnosis, again, in variable forms of variable attention stimulus trait. ADHD is what most folks call it, and doing coaching for them so that they can access that superpower in the different parts of their organization to their individual benefit, as well as that for their team.
Thank you for listening to the Courtemp Arts Podcast Network. To listen to more Courtemp Arts shows, visit courtemparts.com.